What's up, everybody? Tim Anderson here, aka Renfail, the bearded dwarven princess, and I'm branching out, I guess, a little bit. Luke and Leia are behind me, passed out on the bed, and we're here today to talk about House of Dragons, and is it better than Rings of Power? And I'm curious. I have no frame of reference here, but I've got fans who have been asking me to go review the House of Dragons show, and I am a fan of Game of Thrones. I read the books up to a certain point, watched the series, enjoyed it, but I don't have the same intimate level of knowledge that I do with, say, Tolkien and Lord of the Rings, which has enabled me to sort of at least give credible reviewing to the Rings of Power rant series that I do, and then the discussions for the Mondays and Middle Earth show, and so on and so forth. But I digress. We're going to dive in today. There's some great articles out there that are giving me sort of a little bit of a taste test to see whether or not I'm going to enjoy House of Dragons and is if it's something that I'm really going to want to put out there on my YouTube channel. I'd love to get your reaction in this video. So as we go along, let me know your thoughts. Like, subscribe, hit the bell icon, all those good things. Thanks to all of these amazing people for supporting the channel. More information at the end on how you too can become a supporter. In the meantime, let's dive in here. So there's an article over at Collider. It says House of Dragons versus House of Dragon, excuse me, versus the Rings of Power. Why the Game of Thrones spinoff is a better starting point for non-fans. Now, before we go any further, I should state for the record, I do have at least a passing familiarity with what's going on in House of Dragons because it's everywhere on social media, and also there was a lot of production hype going into it about, oh, it's another white powerful woman, and George R. R. Martin, although he was involved in the production of this, talked about how they did some color swapping on some of the actors and so on and so forth to add more diversity to the show, even though that's not necessarily the case in the book, which is one of those trigger issues for a lot of people in the sense that it feels like fake diversity, which we saw a lot of that going into the Rings of Power production as well. So there's, I'm familiar with the fact that it's, a prequel story about the Targaryen family and so on and so forth. And I did actually do a video about this a few months back, about why I wasn't really that hyped about House of Dragon, and I wasn't really planning on adding it to my agenda. However, because of you, the fans, reacting to all of my Rings of Power videos, and I've had people questioning me, hey, are you going to eventually do the House of Dragon show? And I said, well, I suppose I could. I mean, it kind of depends on whether or not people want to hear my take on it, because I'm not going to be able to come into it with the knowledge that I have with, Tolkien. I'm going to be going into it cold because I have not read the prequel book that Martin wrote. Mostly because I'm a stubborn old fart who says I'm not going to touch anything that he writes until he finishes the Game of Thrones series. So, but that's just me being a stubborn old fart. Anyway, let's go into this article here at Collider because I think it explains some stuff to me, and I'd love to have everyone dropping their comments below. Get me up to speed. Help me understand things a little bit more because these articles are great. There's one here at Collider, another one at Forbes that I've got pulled up. That'll be in the discussion point below, and I'm just kind of reading through this, trying to figure this out. So. It says here that this is House of Dragons is a better spin-off, a better prequel series in terms of a better starting point for non-fans because of the barrier to entry, and the barrier of entry being a lot lower with House of Dragons. Now, I understand that because, for the one thing, with Rings of Power, they're going back into a area of time that was thousands of years in length, and they tried to condense that down to a couple hundred years. Whereas with Game of Thrones, with House of Dragon, they're only going back a couple hundred years. So there's not the complexity of storyline here. And I think they mentioned that in both of these articles. Both prequels are based on source material written by authors. It says some prequel stories rely heavily upon an expected knowledge of the source material, while others provide a good starting off point for those who are entering the universe for the first time. The first few installments of both shows have been rewarding for longtime fans of Martin and Tolkien, respectively. However, the barrier of entry for first-time viewers is much lower for House of Dragons. House of Dragons takes place a full 2 centuries before the events of Game of Thrones. Although it takes place within a recognizable version of Westeros, there aren't any crossover characters, which is different than Rings of Power, which has, and this, I will say this is actually sounds pretty true in the sense that one of the issues that's causing, arguments among fans and non-fans and new fans and long-term fans and all these people who have different interpretations of Tolkien's works is that everyone has a different interpretation of what Galadriel should look like and what Galadriel should be doing and what Elrond should look like and what Elrond should be doing and what Gandalf should be doing and what Glorfindel should be doing and what Gil-galad should be doing. All these characters who live for thousands and thousands and thousands of years and who show up in multiple iterations and who have been portrayed on film before. That's not the case with House of Dragons. We've never seen these characters on film before, so there's no expectations set. So I could see that being something that is easier to get into. It says the devil is in the details, and Rings of Power does not spend enough time explaining those details. I have complained about that a lot in my reviews of the show. It says the events of the Rings of Power are explicitly tied to the story of the Lord of the Rings, the creation of the rings, Sauron's first downfall, the destiny of the elves, so on and so forth. It says the Rings of Power doesn't take the time to re-explain the significance of what's going on. The sailing to Valinor and Sauron's symbol are characterized as important but not fleshed out in detail. If you have watched my reviews on Rings of Power, the perspective of my wife, who has never read the books, she's completely lost on some of the storytelling elements. Like, she literally asked me, as Galadriel was sailing to Valinor in like the first episode, why did she jump off the boat? If the elves sailed to Middle Earth to fight a war and they're sailing back to their heaven, to their their land, because it's like their retirement and they can cross back into, why can't she just come back in? Why does she feel that she has to jump off the boat in the middle of the ocean? Why can't she just go there, get on a boat, and come back again? And I was like, that is a very good point, and I don't have an answer for you because they haven't explained the barrier to Valinor in the show. They haven't explained that, and so it's a very good point here. Things are characterized as important, but they're not fleshed out in detail. It says, comparatively, the story in House of Dragons is fairly contained. Within the first episode, as an example, it's entirely focused on an internal family's struggle. We get the fact that there's a conflict brewing, so on and so forth. It says the conflict in Rings of Power is also much less clear. The show isn't even done introducing all the primary characters at the end of the first 2 episodes. I would argue that it hasn't even finished by the end of the first 4 episodes, which are now out as of this recording. We're still getting introduction to characters. Each civilization lives in a different location. And it says in the first House of Dragons episode, by comparison, we never go beyond King's Landing and Dragonstone. It says Rings of Power has to do too much work. House of the Dragons far more contained. I will say this is a big thing because when you have a contained storyline, you can focus more on character development. And that's one of the areas that Rings of Power is lacking. We have lots of plot development, big story. Numenor might go under. Sauron's raising an army. Sauron might come back, but we're not being given enough time to develop characters, and as a result, a lot of the characters are lacking in the Rings of Power. So I totally get that. It says here that it's admirable that both shows have chosen to put female protagonists first. I don't have a problem with that as long as it's not forced or fake. It says while both the characters are compelling, the young princess is more relatable to people than an immortal elf warrior. Very, very good point here. Galadriel's character arc is less clear, especially muddled in the show. And it says House of Dragon does not have the rights issues that the Rings of Power has. Holy shit, this is so true. But this is also the difference between an author who's alive and willing to participate in the adaptation and an author who's been dead for 100 years and whose son is dead and whose grandson is now in charge, and there's certain things that they have the rights to and certain things they don't have the rights to, so they're trying to make a show about the Second Age when they can't really talk about the Second Age because they don't have the rights to all the stuff that's in the Second Age from the Silmarillion book. I agree, this is confusing. Yeah, that's true. So they don't have the same restrictions. But I also, this is the true. They say original author George R. Martin is actively involved as a creative and executive producer, which is one of the reasons I have been reluctant to watch this show because I'm like, dude, you just need to finish Song of Ice and Fire, man, because we've been waiting 11, it's been 11, 12 years now since their last book. The Game of Thrones show finished, and you still have 2 books left to finish. Hurry up, dude. Come on, let's go. Chop, chop. It's also worth noting that the Tolkien family or the Tolkien estate has never been supportive of any adaptations of his work on the screen, including with Christopher heavily critical of Peter Jackson's award-winning trilogy. Great points made in the Collider article. Now, over on Forbes, they do have some similar points. But the one thing here is that they talk about how both shows have had sexism and racism that their casts have had to face. Both shows feature badass women as their leads, traditionally trying to take it a traditionally white fantasy setting more diverse by adding black actors. But it says here, House of the Dragon's ratings are miles above Rings of Power. And the author says, I think there's something to that, given that both shows have championed diversity and received similar pushback. However, it cannot explain the reception gap or the entirety of Rings review bombing. At the end of the day, it appears that House of Dragon is just pulling ahead by leaps and bounds in terms of rating, in terms of viewership, in terms of everything. And I think a lot of that is because you're dealing with what the Collider article was talking about. Martin is actively involved in the development of the House of Dragons show. So we're getting something that's much truer to the source material as opposed to what we're getting with the Rings of Power. Also, we don't have expectations of characters because we've never seen these characters before. So there's that to be considered. It also says that the baseline House of Dragons is simply a better show, at least in the early episodes, whereas Rings of Power has cast an ultra-wide net with maps, with locations and characters all across the map. And a nebulous villain. House of Dragons sets up a very small conflict, a good old-fashioned power struggle for the crown, which is the core story of the Game of Thrones, but on a smaller scale. It says it immediately established a host of great characters as opposed to doling them out over long periods of time over multiple episodes. No reason for a whole season of setup here. The action is here and now. These characters are compelling from the jump, and I just don't think that's true about Rings of Power. Absolutely agree. Dun, 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 dun. It also says part of the experience says part of this is just the experience. House of Dragons is run by Game of Thrones veterans who clearly know what worked about the heart of that series, whereas Rings of Power is run by first-time showrunners who are faced with a steep learning curve. They also have a huge amount of baggage with Tolkien's lore and fans who are disputing the changes the show has made to the world. House of Dragons isn't receiving any of that pushback because George R.R. Martin is actively involved. I know. I am planning on adding House of Dragons to my repertoire here on YouTube. Obviously, I'm a little bit behind the curve now because they've already aired several of the episodes, so I'm not going to be reviewing the most current episodes right away. What I am going to try to do is this weekend and into this upcoming week, now that I've kind of backed off of leveling my characters to 70 in World of Warcraft, I've got more time this week coming up to watch episodes. So I'm going to be trying to get through the House of Dragons episodes and get them out and review them. But I would love to hear everyone's thoughts here. What do you think about these two shows? Is House of Dragons better? I've heard that it is. The articles I just read clearly state that it is. I've heard multiple people in my community saying that it's a better show. I've heard other things that make it better, like better costume design in House of Dragons. It's grittier, more realistic, better writing, better directing, better cinematography. I've heard all of these things, but I would love to hear your thoughts. Here's the most important thing, though. If you like what you see here today, like, subscribe, and hit the bell icon, because I need to know that you want more of the same. Drop your comments down below. And if you want to support like the rest of these amazing people, there's a few things you can do. First and foremost, make sure to drop a super thanks on this video. It's $2, $5, whatever you want. You could join as a member of the Adventurers Guild as well down there for $2.99 a month. It's a great way to support me as a content creator. And then if you want to go above and beyond, there's links down below to our Patreon page and beyond. You can always tune into a live stream as I play RPGs and MMORPGs and beyond. Look forward to your thoughts. Love to hear what you guys think about House of Dragons versus the Rings of Power, and hopefully I'll see you in the next episode as I review both of these shows and continue to rant about Rings of Power and beyond. Cheers, everybody. Have a good day.